In this segment of Harford's Heritage, we interview historian John W. McGrain at his residence in Towson, Maryland, where he has made his home for more than 3/4 of a century. During his distinguished career, John has written many books, published a variety of articles, and taken thousands of pictures of historic sites. After spending 30 years as Baltimore County's historic planner, he retired in 2006, but continued his photography and writing while always graciously helping others with their history projects. His discussion will focus on research and writing about our beautiful Harford County.
I was born in Baltimore City and grew up in a subdivision called Ashburton that was in the neighborhood of Hanlon Park and Hilton Street, Liberty Heights Avenue. Not very large subdivision, and the Ashburton mansion is still there. It belonged to a railroad president and a bank president of the old Giddings family, and it was laid out into lots about 1918. And my family had a big boxy house there with what is now called the American Four-Square House. I had a completely empty playground across from the house, went through to the next block, and across the street diagonally a couple of house lengths was Our Lady of Lourdes Church, Catholic Church, and upstairs in that church building was Our Lady of Lourdes Grammar School. I started going to grammar school there in the autumn of 1937. One of the things I remember that from Ashburton was the one summer the Graf Zeppelin flew over the enormous hydrogen-filled balloon, rigid aircraft flying over Baltimore because they couldn't land at Lakehurst, New Jersey because of a storm. And during the war, Franklin Roosevelt passed out Liberty Heights Avenue right past our school lot, and the principal wouldn't let us go out to wave greetings to him. Yeah, my father inherited this old house that his grandfather had built as a retirement home. My great-grandfather was the estate manager of the Egberth estate, owned by a famous traveling actor named John E. Owens, who had come here from Liverpool, and the name Egberth has nothing to do with the birth of eggs, but was a suburb of Liverpool. Went to high school at Loyola High School, Blakefield, a little west of Towson. We went there in a station wagon. There were so few kids from Towson going there. The News American used to sponsor a history quiz every year, and kids from all over Maryland would go and fill out a sort of a SAT brochure, what do you know about history? And in 1947, I was came in third and got a $50 bond. And then the next year, I came in first in the Baltimore region and got a $500 bond. And they asked the usual questions about history and civics, and happened to know just enough about the United Nations to squeak through this test. Well, after high school, I attended Loyola College. It's now called Loyola University, Cold Spring in Charles. And that was the last year there were large numbers of veterans passing through the college. And I majored in English and had a lot of fun. I was drafted in the summer of 1953, about a month after the truce between China and North Korea and the United States. But everybody who was drafted that year was technically a Korean veteran. went to signal school at Fort Monmouth, New Jersey, and learned about radio transmitters, and went to Germany to practice that profession with a small radio station in Bamberg, or we might call it Bamberg, out in Upper Franconia. Colonel Greathouse met me on the sidewalk one day and said something to the effect that, "You're all right, but it's those other guys are no good." And he was referring to the radio staff who were quite unsatisfactory as troops. After I got out of the service, I got a job at Bendix Radio in Towson, and in their publication and technical publication office. And I started out assembling books with lots of illustrations and working on that. And first we had an office in the basement of a drugstore in Timonium, and then later we moved into the old Bendix plant on East Joppa Road. Well, when I was touring Tennessee in 1964, I went into the State House after breakfast and saw an enormous room where people were repairing old handwritten ledgers. And some of them went back to the very late 1700s, 1800s, and these big, heavy books were being repaired. And I wondered, does Maryland have anything like that? And in those days, I worked at the Technical Service Company in Glen Burnie, so it was easy to sneak out from Glen Burnie and go to Annapolis any afternoon. So I went down there and found out that they had treasure trove of information going back to the 1600s when the colony was first settled. Well, I never thought I'd write history, but next thing you know, I was into gathering facts and putting them on 3 by 5 inch cards, and that's the tipping point there. Once you do that, you're into history. One day in the autumn of 1964, I decided to use my last vacation day and go up to the Strasburg Railroad up near Lancaster, Pennsylvania. On the way, I stopped at the Jerusalem Mill, which is a big, boxy wooden building and set in a river bottom, and utterly fascinating place. And I got some pictures of that and started going up to Harford County on weekends to look for more mills. I didn't think there were any mills in Baltimore County. I hadn't run into them up to that point, just driving around as a tourist. But there were lots of mills in Harford County and other interesting things like canals and lime kilns and that kind of thing. I had 4 Volkswagen Bugs that were ultimately sacrificed to both commuting and tourism. Well, the Volkswagen Bug was first affordable, and it was fast. It would do 80 miles an hour, and it would maneuver into places easy to park along the edge of the road. Well, at first I'm getting the last of the life in my old Zeiss Contina camera that I bought in Frankfurt, and that wore out. I think the shutter blades fell apart. And then I got some off-brand Japanese cameras that did wonderful work in spite of not being famous. And then I got a Canon at some point, and the Canon, of course, was a through-the-lens 35mm camera. Well, after an extremely long time, digital cameras were coming along, and we used one in the planning office, and it was very small. I didn't think it did very artistic work, but by December 2005, there were wonderful digital cameras you could buy, And I got my first Nikon digital at that time. I found that you could photograph some interesting architecture by going on these Maryland garden pilgrimages. It was mostly elderly ladies who took these trips, but you could see some great architecture if you bought a ticket. It only happens in the spring. I went to the Ladue Gardens and saw all his trimmed hedges and all. He was alive at the time and entertaining the ladies that came there. And he had a beautiful, wonderful private library. And he lived in a rather old frame house. I got into researching Priest Neal's Mass House that was mentioned in the Guide to Maryland. The old WPA guidebook to Maryland mentioned it was on Priest Ford Road up in Harford County at Deer Creek. And it dated back to the period when Catholics were suppressed in the old Maryland colony by law. The Church of England was established and Catholics were not allowed to build chapels, and the only thing they were allowed to do was to meet for Mass in private homes. And this was one of the private homes. And in fact, the wealthy Irishman gave like 120 acres to a priest who lived there and put on Mass every week, and also toured around to other places and put on Mass. And this house was belonged to Colonel William Graham and his wife, and they were quite conscious of the historical significance of it. And there had been a mill there, and so Colonel Graham showed us around, and I got to writing up the history of it. 3 people had written about it before. They weren't aware of each other's work, and I more or less integrated everything they had and found some new stuff about it. And of course took lots and lots of pictures. Yeah, Mr. Clarence Jordan was a member of St. Ignatius Hickory Parish, and he came around here one day when I was at work and hunted up my father, and then we got acquainted. And he was a retired New York banker who lived up in Bel Air, and he was writing a parish history, which he completed, and it was about as thick as a novel, a very, very long book. And he had me go out and photograph houses of the original members of the Priest Neal's Mass House Parish and the St. Ignatius Church Parish, and photograph places where Catholics held services during the time of being repressed. And we took lots and lots of pictures. Went all the way over to the eastern shore to some of the, what he called the daughter parishes of that church. I was copying different things at the Maryland State Library, which was in those days in the old Court of Appeals building that's recently been torn down. And some library user had been looking at an enormous bound volume of the returns from the 1880 Census of Manufacturing, when the census taker wrote down the size of water wheels and the speed of water wheels, and wrote down how much business each mill did per year, and of course the name of the miller, number of stones he had. And in 1880, it was all stone grinding. It was only 2 or 3 years later that mills started putting in steel roller units that would make even purer white flour without millstones. The Department of Agriculture has a 14-story tower at Beltsville, right on the Washington Beltway, and they have this library, rare books, all kinds of botanical and animal books from the early 1800s, and they have a complete run of all kinds of magazines. including the American Miller that was published in Chicago starting in 1872. And the American farmers or millers would write into this magazine about what they were doing, what equipment they were installing. They write in about how good the grain crop was in their part of the country. And the most least successful miller in some backwoods part of America would write in and get almost as much publicity as Pillsbury in Minneapolis, and so they were all taken seriously by the editor of this magazine. There are countless Maryland stories sent in, and reports, one or two line reports on which Maryland mills burned, which one installed roller equipment, that sort of thing. So it was a gold mine of information. You just had to go to that library and flip through their successive copies till you found something about Maryland. My favorite article, and it seems to be a long time ago, I called Goodbye Old Brewer, because a Maryland miller had coined that saying that his old stone-powered mill was being driven out of business. The burrs were what they called the grinding stones. And that was a miller in Frederick County named Perry. And that was a great quote. And the millers usually wouldn't tell you anything. The last of the living millers usually wouldn't tell the tourist anything, but they would write to the American Miller magazine or the Northwestern Miller magazine and tell them things. I went out with one of my old friends one Sunday, and we found the water wheel was going around, and the gentleman was sticking his head out the window, and we went inside and bought some cornmeal. That was Mr. John Amus. He was quite advanced in years at that time, and he could run his whole mill all by himself, and he had a little hole-in-the-wall office, and tourists were trooping through there. People I knew from Towson popped in, Mr. and Mrs. Cornell, who were interested in history. And that was a mill that always looked like it was going to topple over and fall down. It was built of logs, and it had that look of a house of cards just about to let go and collapse. And in recent years, after Mr. Amus died, some new owners are doing what they call a restoration. They've covered up the logs with siding of some kind. It's no longer authentic at all. But it was a wonderful place to shoot pictures of logs made of splintery wood and catching the sunlight, in the 1930s style of photography. I was asked to give a slideshow, which they call the Archer Lecture, their annual lecture. And then the following year, I gave something called Tea and Conversation. And the editor, Mr. Krismer, asked me, could I turn it into an article? Well, a lot of it was just given off the top of my head, so I had to buckle down and type it up and include some of my favorite pictures. And it's a small publication, but the pictures came out very well. I think I got interested in covered bridges, and the bridges over the Susquehanna in the early 1800s were sort of makeshift bridges that were a whole string of covered bridges rather far up the river, where it was rocky enough to span the river with a series of bridges. And then I started writing an article, and I think Jim Krismer said someone else is writing this article, so I quit for a year or two, and nobody actually wrote that article, so I picked it up again, photographed the steel bridges of recent times, hiked up the trail to find a place to shoot the B&O Railroad's bridge. I was able to shoot the Amtrak bridge with some of those Acela trains going across it. You can stop the motion of the Acela train if your camera is good enough. I think Millography comes from the Latin, and I invented it when I first started collecting mill data. It's merely the study of mills, and it's online now. If you go online, you'll find this word, and it leads back to Ted Hazen's website about old mills, and he credits me with the word in his website. And for all the Maryland counties that I wrote up, I called each chapter Millography, Anne Arundel County, and so forth. And I eventually covered the whole state. Some regions had very few mills, hardly any in Allegheny and Garrett County, but you'd be surprised there were quite a number of mills on the eastern shore. You think with its low elevation, there wouldn't be any places to dam up water 8 feet high to make a mill pond, but the eastern shore is full of mill history. Millgrain was hard to get at because there's a big private property, but the next thing you know, it was up for sale. I had an open house on Sunday. You could go up there and get close to the mill and get photographs, and because usually mills are right at the edge of the road and they're not very hard to get at, but some cases they're deep inside a private estate. The mills that were turned into residences usually had some old furniture left, not much else of the mills, like the Chrome Valley Mill was turned into a very spacious home. The owner had the old miller's stand-up desk, and he had some old flour bags, lithographed flour bags from the mill's days of operation. And there were some of those remnants at the Deep Run Mill on Deer Creek. And then there was one that was more or less completely domesticated by the executive of the Otis Elevator Company. That was Whitaker Mill down in the southeast corner of the county. And people seem to like to have these old mills because of the tremendous space you get with turning them into a home. Another mill that was converted to other domestic uses was the Nobles Mill on Deer Creek, and that's a beautiful photogenic place with a steel through-truss bridge over the stream. And the person I've recently talked to about it was an artist. He had a studio in there, and it was a beautiful place. It was a place where I photographed a herd of white goats along the mill stream. That's one of my favorite pictures because it was backlighted, shooting into the sunshine without ruining the film. Lapidum was an old little commercial town where on the edge of the Susquehanna Canal, artificial waterway dug in the early part of the 1800s, and there were just a few houses there in the 1960s, and Lapidum had seen better days. And of course, Lapidum is another one of those words cooked up from Latin, or maybe Greek, I forget which, and it was a nice open place, very totally deserted. After I shot what I thought were all the mills in Harford County, I discovered from the ladies in the Historical Society of Baltimore County that there were mills in Baltimore County, and there's a vast hinterland of rural areas out beyond Towson in the Western Run Valley and Worthington Valley, upper end of the county, up around Hoffmanville, where it was a center of paper making, and there were other mills in Quaker Bottom. Funny name, it meant the bottom land rather than literally a Quaker bottom. And so I went and photographed all those mills, and by that time I was touring Carroll County and on into Frederick and Washington, Montgomery. There are mills in almost every county. The only county that had nothing photographed was Calvert, or as they say down there, Culvert County. And the famous Louis Goldstein told me that he had a mill ruin on his farm down there, but he didn't have a mill. I had so many pictures, I thought we ought to have a sort of a catch-all book covering the state. And I boasted that we had one mill that was down in Worcester County, only 11 miles from the ocean, and other mills were out all the way out into Garrett County, up close to West Virginia. And so we had a scattering of pictures of these mills in the book, and there was a history section where we had to explain what mills were all about and how they went from stone grinding to roller mill grinding. I am 100% Irish, as I can trace it back to my great-grandfather who came here from a place called Westmeath on the east side of Ireland. And then my father had a grandmother who came from County Laix, Laix, and she was from a place called Gary Duff. And I went back and found the Gary Duff house where the old family had died out, and the new owner invited me to lunch along with his wife, and got pictures of that. I like Irish music. It's very, very tuneful, although some of it's quite mournful. But I've been an opera fan since about age 9, listening to the broadcasts on Saturday afternoon. And so I've been to all the great many opera houses in Europe, La Scala, Bayreuth, Frankfurt, Paris. I worked for Baltimore County, where there had been various disgraceful things happening over the years. Notable officials even going to jail, and it was Baltimore County more or less settled down and stopped being corrupt for a while under Theodore Venetoulis, and he was quite an entertaining person. But I was in the newspaper one time on the front page in some story about perhaps writing up historic sites. Somehow I got my picture on page 1 of the Baltimore Sun, and I tossed off the comment, I'm the only Baltimore County employee who ever got on page 1 without being indicted.
Gentleman John McGrain has had a stellar career researching Maryland's history and its mills. For Harford County, this is evidenced by being one of the authors of a major book that addressed the county's grain grinding facilities. His willingness to help others with their research and share his many photographs has been a hallmark of his distinguished career. It has been my pleasure to be a small part of this program, and to John W. McGrain I say many, many thanks.